Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording from our Passover Prep Learning Series.
So for those of you who did this class with me last year, you might remember that this was an hour-long class that went for 2 hours and 15 minutes or something crazy. We're not going to do that tonight. We're only going to meet for an hour. But what I do want to reassure you of, and we're going to go through some of these pieces in just a moment, is that even though COVID for us has changed in terms of kind of the stringencies on our lives, whether that's around masks or distancing or, being indoors with more people, for some of us, obviously not for all of us, that the Passover leniencies have not gone away because they recognize that for everybody, that's not the case, right? People are still immunocompromised. People are still getting COVID. People are still financially struggling because of COVID. Whatever it is, COVID has not gone away. It's just, for some people, become easier. So many of the leniencies that we talked about last year are still in place for this year, which is both wonderful and also, I think, for some a little bit disheartening, knowing that we're going into yet another, quote, COVID Passover. But it means that there are certain things that we've gotten used to over the past 2 years that might feel a little bit easier than they did 5-10 years ago, but that have become ways for us to also feel like we can do Passover to its fullest, and still be comfortable with the halacha, with the Jewish law that we're adhering to. So I'm going to show two PDFs over the course of the hour, both of which I'll put in the chat for you to then be able to print and use and reference as you're preparing for your seders and for the holiday. So one is just the general guidelines of kind of how to prepare for Passover, the koshering, the general leniencies, the fact that this year there's a Seder Friday night, but also Saturday night, which poses some halachic difficulties if you're interested in abiding by, the stringency of the law in practicing, doing Havdalah and then doing the rest of the Seder. It makes for a very late Seder, and for some that doesn't work. So there are some rulings in that paper that I'll show you that you can also look at. And then the other page, or I shouldn't say page, it's like 18 pages, but the other packet is just a list of items. So I think I shared this last year as well, though they update it every year. It's a list that tells you what things need hechshers and what things you could buy now that don't need hechshers, that, will make your Passover prep and shopping easier because you can do some of it now, and not have to worry about waiting for that specifically hechshered milk, for example, on Passover. You probably don't want to buy milk tomorrow, but you know what I mean, that there are items that you could buy in advance, and use without a Passover hechsher very halachically over the holiday. So we'll go through a few of those items, but then I'll just send you the PDF and you can go through it with a fine-tooth comb and figure out how that works for your family. So any initial questions before I actually open these PDFs that you want to make sure that I really touch on? No? Oh yeah, Rebecca? No, you don't.
We can go through the whole thing with Saturday night again.
Yeah, for sure. We can
especially
definitely,
if you have young kids.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, why don't we start with that? Let me open that first. The answer to the simplest answer to that question is you do what you can so that the kids get a Passover experience. So in my family last year, because this happened also last year for Passover, we did everything we possibly could before the first cup of wine. And then we basically did the first cup of wine and all of the ritual items, including motzi and then dinner after the fact. But the kids had eaten before and it ended up, being okay. So, but I'll show it to you anyway in here, and we can go over it very quickly. Hold on. Oh, this is the wrong one. No, it's not. I hear it. Okay. Can everyone see this? I can make it a little bit bigger. Okay, let me see.
How do we get a copy of this?
I'm gonna send it to you in the chat. I will. It's on the Rabbinical Assembly website, but the Rabbinical Assembly website is potentially the worst website known to mankind. So I will. I'll copy and paste it into the chat for you to read. So this is. Okay, so this is just going over only for Saturday night Seder. Friday, just like Shabbat, right? You can start before Shabbat actually starts, and just, you bring in Shabbat with candles, and then you would start the Seder at whatever time. You obviously don't want to do it too early, but let's say Shabbat comes in at 7 p.m., you can start at 6 and you'd be totally fine. Saturday's a little bit more problematic if you're trying to keep to candle lighting times, because you have to do Havdalah before you can actually start the Seder, and Havdalah is an hour later than Shabbat is. So, in some places, as this is going to refer to here in this packet, 8:30 is pretty late to be starting the Seder, especially with young kids like Renee was talking about. So you can do many things before candlelighting. In fact, Rabbi Kligfeld and I, leading a community Seder on Saturday night, are going to be doing quite a bit of the Seder before we actually get to Kiddush, because we're starting at 6:30 and we can't do Havdalah until I think it's like 7:57 or something like that in LA. So we are going to be doing lots of Magid. We're going to be doing parts of Hallel and Nirtza, because those are things that you do throughout the Seder, but they don't have to be at the end. There's nothing that says that Hallel can't be, you don't say Hallel with a blessing. You just say parts of Hallel. So you can do some of the songs of Hallel without any trouble. And you can also do all of Nirtza if you want, at the beginning, because it's just fun kid songs is basically all that Nirtza is. So there are elements of the Seder that you obviously can do beforehand. If you don't want to do things out of order, you can start things a little bit earlier. So it says, let me just see what page it's on. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, okay. So you can, I'm not going to read this to you. I always found it very annoying when teachers would just read things, because I'm going to send it to you and you can read it on your own, but I'll explain it. There are elements of the Seder that even if you don't want to go backwards or even out of order, that you can do parts of the beginning part of the Seder. You just don't do Kiddush, because that's what starts the Seder, and you don't do Havdalah obviously until you can do Havdalah. But there are certain aspects of the Seder right from the beginning, like Karpas, for example, that you could do if you wanted to before the Seder actually starts. Some people, including Rabbi Kligfeld, don't want to do that because Karpas, the second time around is for the second Seder. But if you're under the impression that there only needs to be one Seder halachically, which is in fact the case, then it's really not such a big deal to eat some vegetables that you would say the same blessing for, tonight when I eat dinner, that you would say at a Seder before the Seder actually begins. So my family last year, for example, we started earlier because there are little kids in our family, and we did do Karpas and we did do Yachatz. We did all of Magid, except for the parts of Magid that are very specific to do after a cup of wine. So we did those later. And then I think that was it, because, we did Orchatz before we did Karpas. So we did Orchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid. And then by the time we did those things, the kids were, eating dinner or whatever throughout all of that. And then by the time we got there, we were able to do Havdalah, light candles, etc., and then do the rest of the Seder. So you can do that, which is what this is telling you. The easiest thing to do with a Saturday night Seder is do Magid, right? It's a very long part of the Seder, and you can do it before candle lighting because you're just telling the story. So start at 6:30, tell the story, have some appetizers if you want, sing some songs, and you'll be at Havdalah before you know it, and you will have done very large chunks of the Seder. Any questions on that, on how that works?
So we would hold off on the maror and the charoset also.
Right. So you can.
And all the stuff that's on the Seder plate, essentially.
You can. Again, if you're going to really go by machmir halacha, yes. And if you're going to go into the psyche of a second Seder to begin with, you can do those things before candle lighting. They don't have a specific blessing for Passover. So you don't want to eat matzah before the second Seder begins, right? You don't want to eat matzah or drink wine before the second Seder actually begins. So therefore after Havdalah, but all the other things would be the same if I ate them today. So those elements, though symbolic, don't actually probably matter to do before Havdalah and Kiddush, unless you want to be very, very stringent in, the diaspora Jewish law of having two Seders. So there is some leniency, and you just have to decide what's good for your family. But it's probably okay either way. One is just a little bit more stringent. Tybal.
So, and I don't remember what we decided, because last year I had someone coming from Israel. This year it's England, Maryland, Texas, and things in between.
Wow.
So, and England is 5 hours. Texas is what, 1 or 2? I don't remember. But the point is, when you're looking, and this is even first night, but even second night, when you're looking for the rules of what time do you use, when you can do something, whether it's bringing Shabbos in along with the Seder, when it's Havdalah, moving Magid first, I get that, but whose time zone do you use? The latest one or the host, the leader?
The leader. So, this was never a problem before Zoom, right? So you would always go with the leader's time zone because they're the ones who are guiding everyone else. It's everyone else's, ability or, I don't know what another word is. Like it's between them and God, as to if they're comfortable with the time zone that you're in, which they probably are if they're coming to your Seder, and then they're either doing things more in the correct time or earlier than they should be, but they would know that, based on where they are in the world. Again, this was never a problem before we used Zoom Seder, so there's no halacha that says this anywhere.
Oh, yeah. No, I know. But just to say, it's not that Zoom is available. It's for me, I'm just saying it's a pandemic thing. And thank heavens we have Zoom.
Oh,
or
totally.
It would just be me and my spouse, and that would be really sad.
No, totally. I'm definitely not judging it. I think it's a great praiseworthy thing to have. I was just using that as a caveat to say I'm making this ruling, but at the end of the day, there's nothing written about this anywhere. So
yeah, but you know what? I chose to ask you.
That's true. Well, there you go. That's
right.
Great. So yeah, you would go with the host's time zone. Okay, so let's look at this relatively quickly now that we've gone through the Saturday night piece. Let me just make you a little bit smaller so I can see it. Okay. So for those of you who are typically with me on a Tuesday night at 7, and we're talking about koshering and all of those kinds of things, one of the main principles that you'll know is that you kosher something the way that you use something. So that is the same this year as it is any year. Now, in terms of how much you kosher, one of the things that we've learned during COVID is just to kosher that which you need. Don't go nuts. Right? If you once used to host a Seder for 45 people and that meant that you entirely turned over your entire home and now you're just hosting for 4 people, you don't have to kosher everything that you used to kosher for 45 people. Just kosher that which you need. So maybe that's 1 pot instead of 3. Maybe that's 1 set of silverware instead of all 4, right? Just you decide what's best for you. And in some households, what will be best and easiest is using paper, right? And not having to kosher plates and cutlery. Obviously, you should kosher pots and pans if you don't have specific ones for Passover, because you can't use paper for that. But those things are still leniencies in place. I'm not going to go, Rabbi Dorff went over koshering last week. So if you're interested in that, it's on the podcast. I'm not going to go through koshering too much today, but I just wanted to mention that because in terms of in terms of how you're preparing, that is definitely a big part of it. So I'm going to send this to you. So the fact that I'm scrolling is, I'm going to give it to you to read more in depth. So here it says, this year, due to overall COVID limitations and in order to limit individuals having to check multiple stores, if you're unable to find an item below with a Kosher for Passover certification due to COVID, then here's what you can do. So what this isn't saying is go out of your way to not need Kosher for Passover hechshers. But what this is saying is if you only want to go to one grocery store to limit your exposure to other people, do so, and know that these items in this list are okay to not have a Kosher for Passover hechsher. So that's what this is saying, right? Halacha often does that, where it's not suggesting the leniency, but it's allowing the leniency if the stringency is not good for you, right? If it's not something that's going to work for you, for your family, or for this year. So things like baking soda, eggs, obviously fresh fruits and vegetables, which never need a Kosher or Passover hechsher. Fresh or frozen kosher meat also never needs a Kosher for Passover hechsher. Any kind of Nestea tea, specifically that brand. Then it says here, pure black, green, or white tea leaves, unflavored tea bags, unflavored regular coffee, right? So if you're someone who's only going to go to Trader Joe's, for example, that has very limited Kosher for Passover items, you could get unflavored coffee, which I get from there all the time, and be totally fine with it, even though it doesn't have a Kosher for Passover hechsher. Just so you know, there are certain people who won't drink coffee that's not hechshered. So you also have to think through, other people coming to your home for whom that won't be comfortable. But if you're someone like me, who I'm going to be the most, machmir person who's eating in my home, then I can get those things and be totally fine with them, as opposed to getting, the Kosher for Passover brand of coffee, which is terrible and, $85 a can. Yes. So decaf does need a hechsher because of its process. I think we went over this a little bit last year, but flavored coffees and decaf coffees go through a different kind of processing. And so they do need a hechsher. You'll see on the other list, there's a specific brand of decaf that I think you can buy that doesn't need a hechsher, but general decaf coffee would need a Kosher Passover hechsher. We bought too much kosher lox last week. Okay to use unopened bags for Pesach. Yeah, 100%. Just freeze them, and don't open them. Like don't have them near chametz now, right? Freeze the lox, and then you can use them. You can use them on Passover, no problem. Olive oil, right? I never buy new olive oil. I don't live in a kitchen, or maybe I should say I don't eat in a kitchen where my olive oil is ever touching anything. And so I never buy new olive oil for Passover, because there's no way that it's being contaminated over the course of the year. I know that some people aren't comfortable with that. That's totally fine. But you don't need to buy new kosher.
So you'll use it opened? If it's an open bottle of regular olive oil, you'll still use it?
Because I don't use the olive oil, like I put it in another thing. So I don't use the bottle that it comes in for like regular daily use. So yes, I will. It just depends on how you use it in your home. But I'm okay using opened. Whole or half pecans. So basically nuts that are whole or halved that you can have on Passover, as long as they're not pieces and therefore haven't gone through some kind of grinding machine that potentially had other nuts that aren't okay for Passover, are totally fine. So if you go to Trader Joe's and you get whole pecans or whole walnuts next week, those are totally fine for Passover, which often I will do. Raisins, they don't have to be kosher for Passover, but they do have to have an OU on them, which is interesting. That has to do with the process of them as well. So you have to know that they were produced in a kosher facility, but they don't need to have been specifically produced for Passover. Kosher wine. This is one that I don't even hold by. I just find it weird to drink kosher wine that doesn't have a Passover hechsher. If I run out of wine over the course of the holiday and I have a kosher bottle of wine, I don't mind using it at the end. But for the Sidarim, I only use kosher for Passover wine. But what this is saying is if you can't find kosher for Passover wine, you can use kosher wine that doesn't have that P on it, making it $5 more expensive than it was 2 days ago. And that you can totally use it knowing it's exactly the same. Plain butter, that does not include margarine. So margarine is often made out of soy. And so even if you eat kitniot, that it's not the same. You have to have a kosher Passover symbol on it. Obviously water. I always love that water is on these lists because it's just water. Okay, so this is a list of foods that should be purchased before Passover. So anytime between now and Passover, because once you buy them on Passover, they should have a kosher Passover symbol on them based on the way that they are produced. Because the halacha around chametz is that any chametz on Passover is forbidden to you. So unlike, for example, if you come to my class on Tuesday nights and we talk about a little bit of treif getting into a very big vat of something, if it's 1/60th of that vat, it's totally fine. That principle on Passover does not hold. The 1/60th principle doesn't hold at all. So if there's any chametz in anything, it's forbidden to you on Passover. So if you buy it before Passover, that rule is it's what's called a suffix, right? It's as if it's doubtful if there's any chametz in it because you bought it before Passover. And so chametz, without Passover being something that's observed during that time is just stuff, right? It's just stuff that you can normally have. So, hold on one second. Let me just let Karen Cass in. Okay, so frozen fruit is totally fine. Plain cheese, for those of you who buy cheese on Passover, you know that it's extremely expensive and goes bad very quickly. If you buy it before Passover, that's fine. You just have to make sure that it doesn't have any added starches or anything like that, because often cheeses are caked in things that you're not supposed to have on Passover. So you would want to make sure that they don't have those elements. Sugar, salt, quinoa, milk. I don't know why it says white milk. I guess maybe they mean like not chocolate milk. Not really sure. Frozen vegetables. So this is the kind of thing that, no, plain cheese does not need to be kosher for Passover. So plain cheese, if you buy it before Passover, it does not have to be kosher for Passover. If you buy it on Passover, it must be.
You're talking though about hard cheese.
As opposed to what?
As opposed to like cream cheese, for instance.
Yes, right. Yeah. Though some people would say if it's natural cream cheese and there's nothing else in it, it would be the same thing, right? It just has to be a plain cheese. So it can't have anything in it. If you're buying a cream cheese that's been like whipped or has stuff in it, or then no. But if it's just if the only ingredient in your cream cheese is cream cheese, then that's fine. But you just have to look at the ingredients to know for sure. But again, as soon as Passover starts, these are things that you would need kosher or Passover hechshers for. So, you just have to decide, are you really going to eat these things during Passover? In which case you can get them before. If you're not really going to eat them during Passover, just wait. And if you do need them during Passover, you go to a kosher market. Yes, Karen, good to see you.
Why I had 7:30 in my mind, I don't know.
All right.
Sorry for being late. What I'm asking is, can I download this and copy it? Or
you can. I'm going to give everyone both PDFs that I'm showing you, and you can download them, print them, use them. Totally.
I have a question.
Yeah, Bonnie.
I don't know how to do that. And do you have to do it while you're still online so that the chat is up there?
I'll email it to you.
Okay.
I'll email it to you. In the chat, when I put it in the chat, you can just click on it and it'll open up in your browser. Yeah. But I can email it to you. No problem.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Me too, please. I can't deal with the PDF either.
Me too.
Me three.
where a certain demographic is checking.
It's gonna be a PDF no matter how I get it to you, because it's a PDF. But all you do is, I mean, I can do it right now, and you guys can. I'll try it. All you do is when I put it in the chat, you just click on it. So if you all just click on what I just put in the chat, it'll open up in your browser, and then you can just save it. And if you can't, I will send it to you anyway, but just let me know at the end. Okay, so meat, again, like anything that's been cut, you have to get either before Passover or with a kosher Passover hechsher on it. So for example, if you go to Rabbi's Daughter to buy meat, you will find that you can get chopped meat before Passover, and then once Passover starts, I actually don't know if they're open over Passover, but the kosher butchers will have a different kind of meat to sell you based on how they kosher their butcher shops. Plain non-flavored almond milk, or any kind of milk. If you eat kitniot, soy is also fine. So any kind of, this is where ingredients really come into play. So almond milk that is just almonds is totally fine before Passover without a hechsher. See, here's where you see the cream cheese. Yogurt is the same. We talked a little bit about that last year, right? The yogurts on Passover that are like $3 a little thing. You can get regular yogurt. It has to be plain. It cannot be flavored, for it to not need a kosher for Passover symbol. Canned tuna. When I buy tuna for Passover, I just buy it from Trader Joe's. I do not buy kosher Passover tuna because it's exactly the same thing, but the price is just hiked up. So I just buy it in water beforehand. Maple syrup, agave. Again, these things need to be pure. So it would have to be 100% maple syrup. Salt and pepper, decaf coffee. So this is, I think this was Rebecca's question, right? It just has to be plain and not flavored. And you can get it before, but you cannot get it during. Margarine. So if you eat kitniot, it's okay to get margarine, but it has to have a hechsher. It doesn't have to have a kosher or Passover hechsher. Pure honey, dried fruit, club soda. Okay. Any questions on this?
Is quinoa kitniot or not?
No. Quinoa is not kitniot, and everybody should eat it because it's a great source of fiber and protein and easy to make and filling and all those things. A few years ago, I actually made a quinoa crust for pizza instead of like a matzah pizza. And it was really good, but very dense. Like you could only eat like 1.5 pieces because it was like eating an entire bowl of quinoa. But it was really, really good. And if people like to play around in the kitchen, as I do on Passover, it was a fun recipe to be able to make. Okay. So kitniot, if you are spices. So, Esther just asked if spices need to be kosher for Passover. Spices do not need to be kosher for Passover, but depending on how careful you are with your spices during the year, they should either be unopened or they should be spices that you don't use around chametz during the year. So for example, like some people have like a container of salt that they put their hand in. That's not okay for Passover. But if you have like a can, I don't know what else to call it, a container of like rosemary, for example, and the only way that you ever use that is by sprinkling it, a foot away from the potatoes that you cook throughout the year, that's totally fine, to be able to use as long as it's a pure spice and not mixed with anything else. That's totally fine. Some people would say you need to buy new spices for Passover. I think that comes from a time in the world where we didn't know how things were created and cross-contamination was possible. It really isn't anymore in our day. I do not buy new spices for Passover, because I don't use them close to anything. If I have a spice that I know, and I don't, but if I were to have a spice that I know I only use with bread, for example, I might choose, even though, your spice thingy is not touching bread typically, I might choose to get a new one of that just because I know that the connotation of it in my kitchen is that it only is used around chametz. But for the most part, our spices are not used in a contamination type of way for Passover. So I do not get new spices. By the way, a lot of Passover, and I think Rabbi Dorf talked about this last week, though I was in the South and I was not at his class. A lot of Passover comes from custom and family tradition. So if you are someone who always buys olive oil every year, or you are someone who always buys spices, it's possible that came from a place of halacha. It's also possible that came from a place of like, that's what my grandmother did. My grandmother never did that, which is probably why I don't do it. But so much of what we do on Passover comes from like your kishkas, right? Not so much halacha, but really like what you're comfortable with in terms of the tradition itself. Zatar has to be, well, I shouldn't say has to be. I personally would get Zatar kosher for Passover because it's a blended spice. That would just be my suggestion. I also only use it for like hummus and for bread. So for me, those things are not things I'm eating on Passover. I'm just going to the chat. Sorry. Great. Karen is making us all matzah pizza. Thank you so much for that offer. Okay. You can read about kitniot, on your own. I just don't want to spend too much time on it since I know not everybody does it. These things are probably pretty obvious to you, but always need a kosher for Passover hechsher. So anything containing matzah, any kind of baked item, chocolate milk, herbal teas, ice cream, right? Those things need hechshers. The one thing I would say, herbal teas is on here. Often the reason that it says herbal teas is because if they've been opened before Passover, it's possible they've touched chametz. Look at your herbal tea that you have in your house that's not yet opened. And if it doesn't have anything in it other than like tea leaves from chamomile or whatever, it should be fine. So that's the one caveat I would give to this. I would never say that Rabbi Aaron Alexander is wrong by any stretch of the imagination, but I think even he would say this is on this list because often tea bags just sit around your house. But if it's an unopened box, very often something that makes up tea is not chametz and therefore is totally fine for Passover. Liquor does need to be kosher for Passover. Just so you know, tequila is kosher for Passover. So if you're a tequila drinker, you should be fine. And if not, enjoy your potato vodka. It's bad, but enjoy it.
The tequila doesn't have to be hechshered?
It does, but it's easy to find. Okay, so we went over these. I'm just going to stop my screen so I can get to the other one. Any questions on that while I'm just switching PDFs here? I can't see you, so just if you have your hand up, just talk. Okay. So this, what I'm going to show you in just a moment, is a much longer document and goes into much more detail. And the document itself also goes through how to kosher. So those of you who were not on with Rabbi Dorf last week or just want something in writing, you can listen to him on the podcast and look at the packet as well. But we're going to start with food. Okay. So these are obviously prohibited foods. I don't think this comes as a surprise to anybody. What some people think is that even if you find gluten-free biscuits, for example, or gluten-free cake, that it's okay. That's not necessarily the case. Sometimes it's the case that gluten-free something is totally fine for Passover. However, there are other additives in gluten-free products that might not be okay. So, for example, because I work with Rabbi Kligfeld, who is whole food plant-based, I've come to know many gluten-free items at Trader Joe's. Many of them have oat in them, which you cannot eat on Passover. Many of them also have like binding agents that you wouldn't want to eat without it being kosher Passover on Passover. So don't just assume, oh, this pasta is gluten-free and so I can eat it. Totally fine. Not the case. There are some pastas that are gluten-free that you can eat on Passover if you eat kitniot, like lentil pasta at Trader Joe's or quinoa pasta at Trader Joe's, I believe are both okay if you eat kitniot. But you have to look at ingredients very carefully for those things because it's not just the case that gluten-free means Passover approved. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Oh yeah, Helen, go ahead. Just unmute first.
Right. Sorry.
Okay.
Kitniot. What's the reason? If you eat kitniot, you keep saying if you eat kitniot, you can do it. Yeah. I always thought it was Sephardic Jews who ate kitniot and Ashkenazis who didn't by custom, but I'm getting the feeling that's not the way it works now.
Yeah, so it is predominantly the way it works now, but the conservative movement, I think it was in 2015, I want to say, passed a tshuva that said that Ashkenazi Jews are allowed to decide that as a family they are going to eat kitniot if that's something that's going to provide them A, more nutrition, and B, ease of Passover. The reason that most people don't still in Ashkenazi homes is, again, just based on tradition. And as my grandmother says, I just can't imagine bringing it into my house, which is fine, right? Seeing garbanzo beans for her on Passover would be really hard, whereas for me, it sounds delightful to be able to have garbanzo beans on Passover. So it really just depends on if it's a comfort for your family to add kitniot. The reason the kitniot back in the day were not okay for Ashkenazi Jews is because the place in which they were produced was often a place that was too close to potentially be contaminated with chametz. And so now in today's world, it's just not how food works anymore. And so if you buy garbanzo beans in the grocery store, there's no way that those garbanzo beans were also made with rice, right? Or actually rice is okay, but garbanzo beans were made with crackers, right? There's no way that wheat was being milled at the same place that the garbanzo beans were being shelled. So that in today's day is now fine. Some people choose to eat kitniot and some people choose not to eat kitniot. My family, when the ruling came out, I was in rabbinical school, and I remember my dad's a diabetic, and so Passover is often very hard in terms of protein. He's just eating meat a lot, which is not preferred for most people to just constantly be eating meat when you can get protein in other ways throughout the year. And so my mom said, can we eat kitniot? And I said, yeah, sure. I personally have no problem with it. My grandmother really didn't want to do it. And then because rice are kitniot, we had family friends who made fresh sushi. They went fishing and they made fresh sushi on Passover in our house, which was totally fine for Passover if you eat kitniot, and I just couldn't put the rice in my mouth. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I think the thing that we are constantly forgetting is that Passover is 1 week long. And, if you really want to eat rice, great. If you really want to eat lentils, fine. If you really want to eat garbanzo beans, okay. And if you can go without them for a week and it's more trouble than it's worth to have to figure out whether or not you're going to eat kitniot, just don't eat them for a week. But that's why I keep saying that, because it is permissible, but not everybody holds by that ruling right now.
Okay. Tradition.
Exactly. It was a long answer to a very short question. Okay. So, funny that you said that, because you're a kitniot right here. So when I send it to you, you can also read on it and then ask me any questions that you have. Let me see if it says the year though. 2015.
It was 2015 because I went fast and put it in the chat.
Oh, great. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay. So, Okay, so we already went through this list, right? The no Pesach hechsher required beforehand. At all on Passover. Then no Passover hechsher required before Passover. So these are the items, again, we went through this already, but all that are always needed in terms of a Passover hechsher. And then you get into yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
I don't understand. If you could buy quinoa the day before Passover without a Passover hechsher on it.
Yeah.
Why 2 days later, if you were going to buy it, it would have to have a hechsher? It's the same quinoa.
Yeah, it's a great question. Because there is a principle that says that you cannot find and you cannot see any chametz in your home on Passover, but that's only for Passover. So it's a little bit of a legal fiction that if you buy it 2 days before Passover, any chametz that potentially is in that quinoa, which again, we don't believe that there is, or we wouldn't allow it to come into our home. But if there were potentially any chametz in that, the ruling of 1/60th applies. As soon as Passover hits, that ruling no longer exists. And so anything that potentially could have chametz in it is now chametz. So you have to buy a thing that has a kosher Passover hechsher on it. This is why I always suggest that people buy those staples before Passover. Number one, it's cheaper. Number two, it's just so much easier because they might be things that you can buy in a regular grocery store as opposed to like Glot Mart, which is just, I actually like going to Glot Mart right before Passover. People think I'm nuts, but I think it's fun because it's so crazy. But going to Glot Mart right before Passover is like going to the shuk 3 minutes before Shabbat starts, right? Like it's just an insane thing to have to do. So if you're comfortable buying these things before Passover, then definitely do it because it is a leniency that's completely kosher and allows you to be prepared without having to spend more money and go to Glot Mart. Okay. All right. So here go. I know that none of us are dealing with baby food in our lives currently, but just so that you know, things like baby food, right? Or actually Renee's kids are, baby food and medicine, right? Things that are in your household that aren't, to you food, but are still being consumed. Medicine, you should just talk to your doctor, right? If there is a medicine that you're taking, for example, that is made with chametz, but you need to take it because it's your medicine, you take the medicine. Like no one would ever tell you not to take that medicine. And if they did, they have their priorities misaligned. So you should take the medicine, even if it has, flour in it, which I don't know how medicines are made, but I'm sure it's possible there's chametz in some different kinds of medicines. In terms of baby food, sometimes you can find kosher Passover baby food. Buy baby food, right? It's the same as dog food, right? If you are going to be feeding an animal or feeding a baby, neither of those creatures, not to compare them, obviously, are mitzvah abiding creatures, right? A baby does not need to keep Passover. You do. So as long as you're not eating the baby food, and even if you wanted to put it in a separate section of your home, that would be okay. But you don't have to go crazy to either make your own or find kosher for Passover. You don't have to do that. If it makes you feel better, by all means. It's why people buy kosher Passover cream cheese, right? It just makes them feel better. It's not necessary, but if it makes you feel better, do it. And, and great. But just know that the most important thing is to feed the baby. So if the baby food is baby food that has something in it that potentially you wouldn't have in your home on Passover, try to keep it in a different section. Don't taste the food before you give it to the baby, but don't worry about the baby eating it. That's no problem. Okay. All right. So this was one of my favorite things to discover during rabbinical school was that some things that you don't eat, you'll find in grocery stores to have a hechsher. Anything that is not edible does not need a hechsher. You don't need to buy sponges that have hechshers. You don't need to buy cleaner that has hechshers. You don't need to buy, I think my favorite one was silver polish that has a hechsher. You don't need to buy those things. You really don't. If you want to, because that's what your grandmother did, by all means. The reason they sell it is because some people feel like they need it. You don't need it. You really, really don't need it, because you're not eating it, right? And the whole idea, and also aluminum foil isn't being made with chametz. So bal yireh and bal yimtzeh, the idea that you can't see it and that you can't find it, aluminum foil is not a problem, right? You're not gonna find chametz in those products. Even if you're not eating them, you're not gonna find chametz in them. So don't go crazy when you see a sponge that has a kosher for Passover symbol on it. You don't need it. You really don't. You can buy a regular sponge and you'll be fine. You should use a different sponge than you use throughout the rest of the year, but it doesn't need to be kosher for Passover. Okay. I think this is just the bio now. Okay, great. So I'm going to send you, I can even do it right now. I'm going to send you this PDF and you can go through it at your leisure. Hold on a second. And I'm happy to answer any specific questions. Does anybody have any questions about types of food or where to buy the food or when to buy the food, anything like that?
I put a couple questions in the chat.
Oh, great. Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay. Yes, you can. So Batya asks, can you use an unopened box of matzah left over from the previous year? 100% you can. I did that last year. The matzah was stale. Didn't know that matzah went stale, but, so I threw it away. But yes, you totally can as long as it's unopened and it hasn't been sitting with your crackers. It should be totally fine. Gluten-free matzah, what do you suggest? There is great. I actually prefer gluten-free matzah. It is so good. Yehuda sells it. You can get it from Glotmart, which again is, crazy. Or you can probably get it from Ralph's. You can also probably get it online. But Yehuda is the brand and it's so good. It tastes like Pringles. It's really, really yummy. So definitely get it. And people who are not gluten-free should also get it. Yes. Aren't you not supposed to own chametz? Okay. So Rebecca asked the question, in terms of selling your chametz. So we as a shul allow you to sign up on basically a petition of sorts, I guess you could call it, where we sell everybody's chametz to our security guard, to Ralph. And we actually just explained this to him today. He was very excited until he realized that he would have to buy it back and then noticed that it wasn't as exciting as it sounded. But we sell it to him. And then at the end of Passover, he gives it back, we hope, to us, and then it's no longer yours. So the way in which you do that, so for me, for example, I put it all in one cupboard that I close up and I don't use during Passover. And then on the sheet of paper where it says location of chametz, I put where it is. And the legal fiction around this is that if Ralph wanted, I don't know, goldfish crackers that I have in my cupboard, he could come to my cupboard and he could take them out because they're his. So they can be in your house. They just have to be sold. You don't want to see them and you don't want to find them in your food, obviously. So they have to be hidden or just put away. But they can exist in your home. They just have to be sold through this legal system that we have to sell our chametz.
So it was actually a follow-on question talking about the baby food or pet food.
Yeah.
If you're not supposed to own chametz, isn't that problematic to have some things that you're using?
Totally, which is why some people just keep it in a different part of their house, right? So that it's not in your home. It is. And I think that there's just similar to anything in life, right? You have to feed your baby and you have to feed your pet. So unless there's a way to find those things easily that are kosher for Passover, you just do what you can. And then you could sell them, right? You could sell them as part of this legal fiction and recognize that no one's actually going to come for your baby food. And so you have sold them to a certain extent and you're going to use it. What I've seen in my life is that people just keep it in a different part of their house that they're not using during Passover, like the laundry room, or like my grandparents used to always keep the dog food in like a cupboard, and during Passover they would keep it in the garage. So just having it in a different part of the house so that your home really doesn't have the chametz in it, but rather a different location. But you're completely correct that you're not supposed to own it and not even supposed to see it. So, other questions? I'm just looking in the chat, but I don't see any others in there. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns? Anything about Passover in general? Questions or comments?
I learned how to save a PDF. You taught me how to do it. I did it while you were doing it, so thank you.
Amazing.
I have to remember it the next time I have to do it, but for now it's there.
Great. I'm so glad. That's wonderful. Any other? Yeah, Esther, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So, because we have kids coming, we often, and probably will this year, make artichokes.
Ooh.
So that the kids can continue to dip and eat during the Seder, so they don't get quite as restless.
Awesome. Yeah. So on Thursday, I'm actually teaching a class on how to do a creative Seder. And one of the things that I talk about is how to feed kids, during the Seder such that they can stay attentive. And adults, actually. I think that it's important for adults to be able to eat too. In my house, when we were growing up, we had all different kinds of appetizers to be able to eat until dinner. And when I was living in Israel, the family that I was having Seder with did something even kind of more pointed towards the Seder, which was all of the appetizers were karpas. Karpas is anything that you would say borei pri ha'adama over, and anything you can dip. So potatoes, artichokes, celery, carrots, cauliflower, broccoli, right? Anything that has that blessing associated is totally considered karpas. We only think of parsley because that's what's used, but you can have French fries and ketchup for karpas, and you can have carrots and guacamole. You can have jicama and salsa, right? Like you can become very creative with how to make karpas like a real appetizer hour. And artichokes are a great one. I've never done that, but I love artichokes. And you could continue to have people eating up until dinner with those things, and it keeps people very, very engaged. So
one thing that we do is we make a crudité.
Yeah.
And have it dipped in baba ganoush.
Amazing.
And another thing is we take artichokes, cut them in half, scoop out the inside.
Yeah.
Inside, and I make a little salad out of chopped colored peppers, basil, and olive oil.
Yeah.
And it looks pretty because it's the colored peppers. And another thing, we offer an option of a half a grapefruit.
Oh, yeah. That's great. That's great. Yeah. The other thing that I heard last year is for people who eat peanuts, like celery and peanut butter. Great one. Apples and peanut butter. Apples don't have the same bracha, but if you're gonna have other things that have the bracha, you can then go off the deep end. But yeah, peanut butter is a great one also. Yeah.
Then if you do all these appetizers though, what happens to the dinner that you slave over?
I mean, people usually eat it. It usually is just keeping the kids contained, and also, I don't know. My family always ate tons of appetizers and did very well at dinner. So,
and you have more leftovers that way.
Yeah. Right. Tybal, go ahead.
A comment and then a question. So the first year in the pandemic, we were supposed to go out of town and didn't. So it was very last minute, and things weren't in the stores anyway. So for karpas, the blessing, we used banana.
Yeah.
And I learned earlier today, it turns out that was the tradition of a Litvisher Rabbi Mordechai Pinchas Teitz. And because in part he wanted people to know that Hadamah and not Ha'etz is what you say for banana.
Interesting. Yeah.
Anyway, but what I wanted to ask you, because I like every year to buy one or more new Haggadahs, and I already am doing the Marcia Falk, but I wanted to ask if you had any Haggadah recommendations.
Yeah. I mean, I have an entire shelf in my office dedicated to Haggadot. I go on Amazon every year and just look to see what the new Haggadahs are. Yeah, I don't even know where to begin. I can try to take a picture tomorrow of my shelf and send it to you. There's a Harry Potter Haggadah. There's a comic book Haggadah. There's a women's Haggadah. There's like a Haggadah for everything. I would just look up Haggadot and see what looks interesting to you. Yeah, I have no specific recommendations, but I'll try to send you a picture of my shelf.
I'll send you an email to remind you. But what's a good day in theory that's less busy than any other day? Ha ha ha.
What's a good day that's busy?
Like, I wouldn't send it to you on a Thursday because Shabbos is coming and you teach on Friday.
Oh, it doesn't matter. Any day is going to be the same.
I'll send it.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Esther, did you want to ask something? No? Okay. Questions, thoughts, comments? All right. This was much more efficient than last year. Last year, I feel like everyone was very, very nervous. And so we went for a lot longer. On Thursday, I'll be teaching a class in person about the Creative Seder. I will try to somehow record that. It won't be on Zoom because there's just too much interaction to put it on Zoom. I was nervous about how to keep both audiences engaged. But I'll try to record it if possible. And if you can be there in person, that would be awesome. We'll be at Beth Am for that I think it's also at 7, though don't quote me on that. And have a great night, and I will see you all soon. And happy early Passover shopping.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.